Poetry can be inspired by many different things, by nature, by tragedy or triumph, by a personal experience or observation. It is within the mind, heart, and soul of the poet that these elements are given a lyrical connection with something much bigger or deeper. Dr. Glen Mazis, a philosophy professor at Penn State Harrisburg, has been making those connections since he was a child, writing poetry for much of his life. In the last 8 or 9 years, Mazis has published 71 poems in 38 different literary journals. I asked Dr. Mazis when and how he started writing poetry.
I've always written poetry as much as I remember. I mean, it seems like I was, I don't know, probably 7 or 8. I guess it started more with, expressing feelings, emotions, not as much as became later more of a fascination with language and image. But, I was always an introspective kind of person, probably philosophical. Then I think also as a teenager, things that were of concern to me, political concerns, things that upset me, I wrote poetry about. But, I think once I got to college, from then on, I was probably interested in language and image and density of language. And then it became more artistic than just getting thoughts out.
When did you decide to start publishing your poetry?
I had never sent anything out until I was the age of, 49. I think 8 years ago. Is that right? 8 years ago? 9 years ago? Something like that. I had my first sabbatical after 17 or 18 years of teaching, and my best friend was Suren Lalvani, who was a brilliant young communications professor here, who was from Sri Lanka, who'd fled India in his 20s when he was known as one of India's 5 or 10 most promising young playwrights. Suren was my best friend here, and I was just starting my year sabbatical when he died suddenly of a massive heart attack. And he was only he was younger than I was. I think he was 44, 43. And the thing was, when Suren came to the United States, he became a communications scholar, and he gave up his playwriting and his fiction, and he was also a poet of sorts. About 3 months before he suddenly died, he had this kind of crisis, and after not writing creatively for about 20 years, he suddenly started writing this incredible novel about Sri Lanka that every line was so poetic, every paragraph was just so poetic. And then he died. So somehow it was a wake-up call to me that if I ever wanted to publish my poetry, I should probably try to get my poetry out there.
As both a philosopher and a poet, Dr. Mazis has some interesting observations on what the two disciplines have in common and how they differ. Do the two things inform each other, or are they separate for you, or?
Well, that's such an interesting, not just personal question, but it's a philosophical question. Heidegger, who's one of my favorite philosophers, said that the poet and the philosopher live on mountain tops, closest together and furthest away. And I think there's something true about that. There's something very similar. It's about getting to the absolute sort of intense core of things and putting it into language. And yet there's something so different, because one is rational and expository, even if there's a poetic shape to it. And the other one is just on this level of feeling and sound and image and imagination. So they're very similar, and sometimes they feed each other for me. Like this last book I was doing, Humans, Animals, and Machines, the overlap between humans and animals, where I was looking at some amazing animals, like the Clark's nutcracker hides 30,000 seeds in the forest in different places and knows where to find them all in a way that far exceeds human memory. It's about a 6-inch gray bird that lives out west. And I was doing the research in that for the philosophy book, but then I ended up writing a poem about it. That was a rare time where somehow they were feeding each other, but more for me, it's one or the other. It's sort of like different parts of my being or my brain or something.
Dr. Mazis then read the poem inspired by the Clark's Nutcracker.
The natural power of memory. The Clark's nutcracker knows where every seed is stored in tree burrows and beneath wedged rock outcrops. Thousands and thousands of them, as if they were the words of an immense novel, and each one linked with the others to tell a hopeful story that in reading and rereading, paying attention to the tale, and can survive the harsh months of blank, windswept grounds where no comforting messages can be discerned flying above. It's a hidden hieroglyphic of an old avian myth to get through winters, that each bird writes in thistles and seeds, to leave its own Ariadne's thread through swaying evergreens and crackling pines. It's an unfinished composition of wings and beaks, through generations of hatchlings, knowing the braille of the land and the grammar of the sky, and the perfect pitch of the seasons that only a Homer, Tolstoy, or Beethoven can leave for us, secreted in the midst of our winter.
I asked Dr. Mazis where and how he writes his poetry.
If it's nice weather, I do a lot of writing in general outside. I tend to still write the rough drafts on paper, not on the computer. And there's all this crossing out and crossing out. I mean, all writing is rewriting, but like poetry, it has to be obsessively rewritten because, every sound, every comma, every word. I mean, it's all, it's just so precise and cutting it. I mean, any poem, most revising is cutting. It's almost like, you're a sculptor. You get like a certain thing, then you have to like just keep cutting it away to get to the bone. Especially in poetry, you don't want any extra words, which is hard because philosophy is the exact opposite. It's like you always need more and more words. So I mean, it's like the totally opposite process. I mean, philosophy takes endless revision too, but it's always adding things. And poetry is all about, no, you don't really need that word. No, you don't really need that piece of punctuation,
So you do a lot of the writing by hand
By
first.
hand, yeah, a couple drafts. Then I usually enter it into the word processor, but then there's going to be more drafts. And then, there's some poems I've been revising for 20, 25 years.
Really?
Yeah. Some poems are quicker. It would be the rare poem that it seems like I can't imagine a poem that wouldn't have to be revised for at least 6 months, a year. Go through different versions.
Dr. Mazis was inspired by his mother's friend, who died from complications of a brain tumor, to write the following poem.
Nothing to say. The brain tumor, like a cap fitted carefully inside another cap, instead of lining the mind with woolen security, takes the space where your thoughts used to be. Its tentacles reach down to grab words from your sentences, so each line's a metaphor, unappreciated by the cashier and bus driver who can't fathom the sudden poetic inspiration. It takes your tongue by surprise as we both look at the gaps and into each other's eyes, as if the missing words would run across your corneas like the Times Square bulletins as you squint and put a finger carefully along the side of your forehead for ideas that are gone. And I look away from the falling fruit that fills your eyes.